distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm very glad to be at this special academic event for the Foundation of Spanish-American Literature. As a Peruvian national and at the same time an Ibero-American citizen, I will talk about the talented and great writer Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who represents the birth of the mestizo culture in the Americas. When we talk about mestizo, we mean the children of a Spaniard man and an Indian woman, or vice versa. Inca Garcilaso wrote in the royal commentaries of the Incas that since the term mestizo was coined, he used it proudly. On the night of April the 22nd, 1615, in an old house on Dean Street in Córdoba, Spain, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega died. The chronicler, born in Cusco, Peru, had just turned 77 years old and had shortly before given his last will. The next day, Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra died in Madrid, and William Shakespeare died in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. 4 centuries later, the three writers are mentioned, continue to inspire admiration among his readers and scholars all around the world. Forging in his own unique way his utopian dreams, Inca Garcilaso made an exceptional effort to value and integrate the two worlds to which he belonged, the Indian and the Western worlds. His work, full of nostalgia and exaltation of underlying conflicts and dramatic tensions, marks the course of a new mestizo culture in the Americas and makes him the first classic author and one of the martyrs of Spanish prose. His life and work, memory and aspirations are nurtured and depicted in the extraordinary adventure. On April 12, 1539, Inca Garcilaso was born out of wedlock in Cusco, the son of conquistador Capitan Sebastián Garcilaso de la Vega, member of a minor branch of a powerful Spanish noble family, and Princess Chimpu Ocllo, niece of Inca Emperor Huayna Cápac. Inca Garcilaso spent his childhood at his father's home in Cusco. At that time, chaos reigned in the city, shaken by civil wars between the Spanish conquistadores led by Gonzalo Pizarro and troops loyal to the Spanish crown. His early childhood was marked by the absence of his father, enlisted with Pizarro troops. He grew up with his mother and other noble Inca relatives. Along with other young mestizos, also the children of powerful conquistadors, the Inca Garcilaso attended Latin grammar and music classes taught by the expert Juan de Cuellar, who strongly encouraged his students to pursue their education in Salamanca, Spain. The father of Inca Garcilaso died in Cusco in 1559 and left his mestizo son the sum of 4,000 pesos to travel to Spain and complete his studies. Towards the end of 1559, at the age of 20, he left his native land to travel to Spain and never to return. For a time, he shared his quarters with Luis de Gongura, the famous Spanish poet and playwright. In Spain, after an incursion into military life as part of the campaign against the Moorish remnants in Alpujarras, which earned him the rank of Capitan, Garcilaso decided to devote himself to his two great passions, horseback riding and literature. In 1609, Inca Garcilaso published his most celebrated work, dedicated to his maternal ancestors and known by the title of The Royal Commentaries, which was the first part of his general history of Peru. Writing in a style worthy of the Spanish Golden Age, Garcilaso produced the first work entirely dedicated to the glory of the Incas, refunding the criticism of the commentators of his time. In order to organize his material, Garcilaso resorted to archaeology and references to the classical age. The description of the Inca form of government became part of the ongoing debate in Europe regarding political models. Please, somewhat. An Inca became interested, thank you. An Inca, Garcilaso, became interested in the subject through the works of Thomas More and Jean Baudin. Classical Latin works in Garcilaso's library led him to compare the first Inca emperors and the first Roman kings. The second part of the royal commentaries, entitled General History of Peru, was published in 1617, after the author's death. The book deals with the conquest of the Inca Empire by the Spanish troops and subsequent civil wars between the victors. It also includes references to the life in Cusco in the 1540s. For more than 4 centuries, the image of the Incas throughout the world was that which Garcilaso forged in his work. Now, I'm very glad to introduce Mr. Rodrigo Cacho, reader in Spanish Golden Age and Colonial Studies at the Spanish and Portuguese Department of the University of Cambridge, to further explore the foundation of Spanish American poetry. Luis de Miranda, Bernardo de Balbuena, and Pedro Leonia. Thank you.
There's a pointer. Technology, excellent. Welcome everyone. Can you hear me well? Yeah, last row as well? So I don't need to shout, that's good. I would like to start thanking very much Beatriz Nava, first of all, for this lovely invitation, and alongside her, especially the Consulate General of Mexico, Peru, and Argentina, who very kindly invited me to give this talk here today. I feel very honored and very happy to have the chance to spend a bit of time in this wonderful little Latin American corner in Hong Kong with you. I'm very grateful that you came, and I hope that what we will be discussing could be of interest to you. My very brief talk will focus on some elements that are connected with the development of Spanish American poetry towards the beginning of the 17th century. In particular, I would like to deal with some aspects that are very important, not just for poetry, but in general for the literature of Latin America also later on. The constitution of some myths that recur often in later writings and works of art, and also in political thought. Which ideas are we going to discuss? Which one are these ones that return over and over? Why? In particular, I would like to focus on 3 poets. Since this is a joint enterprise, I decided very diplomatically to include 3 poets that represent each one of the countries that has invited me. For Mexico, we'll have Balbuena, one of the first early modern poets of Mexican literature. For Peru, we'll have Oña, and for Argentina, Miranda. Very briefly, I will introduce you to these authors and to their works. Luis de Miranda was a Spanish soldier born in the first years of the 16th century. He traveled to America in the 30s, so very early on in the moment of colonization of America. And basically, like many colonizers of the time, he traveled to foster his personal gain and economic enrichment. He participated in the exploration and conquest of El Río de la Plata, which was a major enterprise at the time, and a very dangerous one, and spent some time in Buenos Aires, which was founded very recently, and then destroyed, and then founded again, and then destroyed. It's a very complicated story, that one, of the city of Buenos Aires and the country that surrounds it. He took vows later on, like many conquerors and soldiers did. It's a very interesting contradiction for us, but that was very actually normal at the time. It happened very often. And decided to spend most of his life then in America, to stay there. And he had also political roles in the government of the region, La Provincia del Río de la Plata, the province of the Río de la Plata. For us, more importantly, from the literary point of view, he's the author of a romance, a ballad, a very short one, 136 lines, where he describes all the sufferings and the difficulties that the first settlers had in Buenos Aires when it was just founded. We know very little about his biography apart from this information, but I hope to introduce you a little bit to his poem. The second author that we will look at is Pedro Leonia. This is a bit of a controversial author. He was born in modern-day Chile, so the Chilean says he's a Chilean author, but he was born in the Viceroyalty of Peru because Chile was part of the Viceroyalty of Peru, so he's also Peruvian. And the poem that we'll be discussing, again, briefly with you, was written in Lima at the time and published in Lima. So it's one of the first literary texts published in Spanish America. It's called Arauco Domado, Arauco Tamed. The Araucanians were these indigenous people that lived in Chile at the time and that clashed against the Spaniards. What Pedro Leonia is doing is continuing the work of a Spanish poet called Ercilla, who was very famous in the 16th century, who wrote an extensive epic poem called La Araucana, inspired in these wars because he had taken part to this conquest as a soldier as well. So Pedro Leonia, years later, decides to continue and improve this text. And the third author that I will consider, so this is Pedro Leonia, as you can see. This is the woodcut that appears in the first edition of Arauco Domado. He's, as you can see, quite young here, and he's also very proudly showing the insignia of the University of San Marcos de Lima. That's the crown that he has there, is the symbol, because he is a graduate of the university, and his studies were funded by the Viceroy, so he's very proud of showing that in this woodcut. The third author that I will quickly talk about today is Bernardo de Balbuena. He was born in Spain, but moved to Mexico at a young age to follow his father. And here, he attended university and then was ordained a priest. And he had a very successful ecclesiastical career. He ended his career in Puerto Rico as a bishop. His most important poem is La Grandeza de Mexicana, or The Grandeur of Mexico, published in 1604 in Mexico City. The text praises the beauty, sophistication, and richness of the city of Mexico at the time, which was one of the largest cities in the world, and definitely one of the largest in Latin America. In this text, then, there are certain ideas that I was mentioning at the beginning that we find they appear in other texts and later on in Latin American culture, and particularly two contrasting and complementary ideas that kind of define some of the contradictions and inspirational works that have been born in Latin America ever since, up until the 19th century at least and beyond. The clash that the Argentinian author Sarmiento defined as the clash between civilization and barbarity. This is not something that he invented in the 19th century. This ideological clash has a long history, even before the New World was discovered, but it acquires a very important role in Spanish America. In a way, Sarmiento comes to say that despite that these two forces are opposed to each other, they are inseparable in Latin America. The essence of Latin American culture is the conjunction of these two, the constant fight and negotiations between civilization and barbarity. He identified civilization with European culture, obviously, and barbarity with the resistance to that culture that both the natives, and particularly the landscape, he says the land rejects civilization. It's such a vast, wild, and untamed territory that really is constantly fighting back the desire of spreading civilization. These are the both sides of the same coin that really highlight some of the driving forces behind European colonialism at the time and afterwards. Who basically is projecting onto this thing that they called the New World the ideas of the Old World, like all colonizers do in a way or in another. Adapting the reality that they found in America, and sometimes and very often misunderstanding it, and trying to make it fit the mold of European thinking. In this process of colonization, it was not just the military and the economic power of Spain that drove it, but another very important role was played by culture and language. Just think about the stress and the emphasis that the Spanish Empire put in the spreading of culture in Spanish America very early on, particularly education. The printing press was introduced very soon in Spanish America. We have the first printing press in Mexico City in 1539. This is quite impressive. And they were already been publishing books in Mexico in 1539. And Lima followed a few years later in 1584. This is very early dates. These presses produced mostly legal documents, text of catechism, and religious texts for the indoctrination of the natives, but also texts that were used in the universities, alongside grammars and vocabularies of indigenous languages. At the same time, as I said, these books were used in universities because also universities were established very early on in Spanish America. 1538, Santo Domingo already had the first university founded in the Spanish American world. It's, again, very early. Mexico followed with Lima in 1551. We're talking about very early stages of civilization. Both Charles V, the Emperor Charles V, and his son Philip II were very aware of the importance of using language and culture as a dominating enterprise in order to expand and control and mirror the power and the culture of the metropole of Spain into the New World. Between 1538 and 1812, 30 universities were founded in the New World. This is impressive. And it's also very, very unique in the early modern period. Just compare with the British colonization of North America. The first university was founded in 1636, Harvard College, to which followed, 2 years later, the first printing press established in North America, Cambridge, Massachusetts, obviously, not the other one. And this was kind of an isolated case, and it took much longer in North America to establish presses and universities. Of course, the British Empire had a different perception of how the colonization had to be taken forward and other kind of interest. The main one is that they didn't find the gold and the silver that they found in America, in South America and Central America. But that's for another talk, and I don't have the time to talk about it. These institutions, particularly the university, fostered the development of a new class, we could say, of intellectuals and bureaucrats who were to run the various institutions established by the empire in the New World. And also, many of them contributed to the literary culture at the time. Many of them were poets or writers or essayists and etc. Both Balbuena and Oña studied in Latin American universities. Balbuena in Mexico, as I said, and Oña, as we saw before, in Lima. Miranda was educated in Spain. He's an earlier case, so it's a bit too early to be talking about this in this context. Who was Balbuena? Balbuena was the illegitimate son of a Spanish conquistador who moved to Mexico in order to foster his career, as he did. He didn't belong to the nobility. He was not socially privileged. But in Mexico managed to do a name for himself, to make a name for himself, and establish himself as a very prominent intellectual figure at the time. He used university and literature as a social platform to climb the ladder in society and establish himself in places of privilege, as other people did at the time. At the same time, he managed to, with his text, and particularly Grandeza Mexicana, to establish a new poetics that was going to be very important later on during the Baroque period. He's often compared, for some aspects, with later poets like Sor Juana de la Cruz, one of the greatest poets in the Spanish language, who lived decades later. The idea of these authors was to use poetry not only for aesthetic purposes, but also as a tool of self-promotion. And in fact, I'm very glad I have this. As you can see, this is the woodcut that appears in the first edition of Grandeza Mexicana, 1604. As you can see, it has a couple of mottos, one up here and the other one down here. I know you cannot read them, but I'm going to translate them to you. They're both in Latin. The first one says, summa laboris habet. In English, it would be something like, this requires all of our labor, all of our effort. And down here, it says, nobilitas sola est atque unica virtus. So the only virtue is the only true nobility. These are two lines taken from classical poets. And what they're coming to say is basically, the true nobility resides in your deeds, not in your blood. Obviously, he wasn't noble. And the work that I'm presenting to you is based on much effort. And that's what you should be considering as a value, not social class, but work. And work, labor in Latin, it's one of the main principles that this new class of intellectuals was establishing their poetry on. They would promote themselves with this. And as you can see, both authors chose to represent their faces in the text that they published as an act of, they were the new faces of Spanish American literature. As I said, the term labor is key to understand what Balbuena is doing in his poem. And there is a moment in the book where he clearly identifies with this class of intellectuals, where he praises the University of Mexico. And he says, well, the University of Mexico is populated by monstruos. Monstruos means monsters, but in the 16th and 17th century, monstro had a very different meaning from the modern one. It didn't mean something horrible. It meant something extraordinary, out of the norm. So it's actually a positive adjective. And he says, the intellectuals and the scholars and the students that we have in Mexico are far greater and far better than any of the ones you can find in Europe. And this is the text that I want to quote from La Grandeza Mexicana, from the 4th canto. It goes in English, here you will find, so in the university, more eminent men in all subjects and disciplines that sands carried in the currents of the Ganges, prodigies of accomplished talents, and eternal pursuers of truths. In Spanish sounds much better, I'm afraid, but I hope you get the gist. In human and sacred letters, so in theology and other natural sciences. Salamanca, Alcalá, Leuven, and Athens, so places of great universities, in the past and in the present, may well boast with pride for their extraordinary letters and sciences. It might well be that they feel proud of having their lecture room full of tassels, of insignias of their different graduates, because they have a long history which we don't possess. So we're newer than them. We don't possess this history. But they do not possess better letters than Mexico has. So we're newer, but we are actually better than them. We don't possess the same tradition, but we will build it with time. So all of these texts represent a bit that excitement of something that is being made anew. Of course, indigenous culture here is completely obliterated and forgotten, which is something that appears a lot in this text. Or when it's represented, it's misrepresented. Luis de Miranda represents a bit the opposite pole of this scale, of this clash between civilization and barbarity. And in his ballad, in his romance, in this text, he presents not a sophisticated city, and not a sophisticated region. Actually, he presents the opposite, a bare land where people struggle to survive and they're constantly attacked by the natives. And they have to fight against this population and also against the elements. His representation of Buenos Aires, which is never directly mentioned by its name in the text, but is represented, gives way to a scene of total destruction and desolation. Here it is. So this is line 65 and 84. In this passage is where he clearly describes the city of Buenos Aires and how people were living there. And what was worse than this, and put us in a terrible situation, of course he's writing this text as a witness, I was there, was the most extraordinary hunger, so it's really this hunger that dominates the text, that you have seen. Food supplies provided of flour and biscuits were only 6 ounces or 8, approximately. The most common food found were thistles, cardos, says in Spanish, which they would look for, and even these were not easy to find, sometimes. Excrements and waste that some did not manage to digest were eaten by several desperate folks, which was a shame to see. The situation was so terrible that as it happened in Jerusalem, even the flesh of man was eaten. So, cannibalism. What we find here is an image of the desert, of the wilderness, resisting, fighting back against civilization and cultural sophistication that we in fact encounter in Mexico in the representation that Balbuena gave us. The universities have not arrived here, and nothing else really. Even the language used by Miranda is much less sophisticated and rich and ornamental than the language used by Balbuena. It's a much more crude and direct and familiar language. And its images are very powerful and disturbing. So you can really see here the description of barbarity fighting back Spanish civilization. More than that, what we see in this text is not only this barbarity, so-called barbarity fighting back, but also as something that is contagious. One of the very typical commonplaces that you find from Columbus onwards when you talk about the discovery of the New World and the conquest is the description of some natives as cannibals. It's one of the aspects upon which the Spanish colonizers placed a lot of emphasis because that justified their, what they call just war against the natives. They eat human flesh, therefore we have to colonize them and defeat them and stop this. As you can see here, that commonplace has switched, and now it's the Spaniards eating each other, not the Indians. Finally, you can see there, then we're going to look at Pedro Leonia. The role of the poet in this ideological clash, then, very often, is represented as thus can mediate between the old world and the new, and between barbarity and civilization. The poet is the one that can transmit and explain these differences to both audiences. So very often these poets place themselves between two worlds. And this is exactly what Pedro Leonia does in his epic poem, which not only talks about battles and wars, but also talks about the landscape and the people of Peru. And what he demonstrates there is the rise of another thing that was very important and was going to be crucial later in the independence of Latin America, the rise of a Creole spirit, the sense of belonging of these people. What we have here is a person that presents himself as the master of the best of both worlds, the European and the American. He says in his text, I am a son of Chile. I was born here, and I'm very proud of having been born here. Like the Inca said, I was born in Peru, so I feel very proud of that, and I was born a mestizo. And he also says, because I was born there, I know many things. This is their Ibunche. He's talking about a ritual celebrated by the natives in Chile. This is their Ibunche, celebrated among them there as a sacred ritual, practiced with the utmost religiosity, paying tribute to their god. I have found this out thanks to some of them, since I live in their country, my beloved homeland. So he portrays himself as belonging as his homeland. And I know their expressions, language, and traditions. So he's saying, I know their language, I can understand them, I can speak to them, and I understand this world. And I also, of course, understand Spain, so I can mediate between the two. So in these works, Balbuena, Miranda, and Oña, we find this clash between civilization and barbarity as they were imagined and fashioned by European eyes, and how these are transformed and then embedded in other discourses like the Creole discourse, as I said. The mind of the colonizers frames the new world as a set of opposites, which is a very simplistic way of seeing reality. In order to control it, understand it, and verbalize it, make sense of it. This dialectic relationship produced in literature the development of an American poetics that we will later encounter in other modern writers. One cannot understand contemporary Spanish-American writers like Borges, Rulfo, or even Arguedas without having in mind this background. A poetics that is made of fascinating contradictions that have been feeding human imagination ever since. Thank you very much. I don't know if you have any questions or I'm supposed to finish here. Yes? I think they're taking...
Well, thank you very much indeed in the first place. It was really sound like everything new to me, even though I am Spanish. And what was the audience of these writers?
That's a good question. So it varies, because each of these texts was born in a different context. For the case of Balbuena, he was writing for the Mexican audience, but he was also writing for the Spanish audience. He was trying to present himself, precisely as I said, as a bridge. The text was published in Mexico, so he was obviously trying to place himself as a prominent figure in the intellectual context of Mexico City at the time. Oña addressed his poem because the poem that he wrote was commissioned by the Viceroy, the living Viceroy. So his main addressee is the Viceroy. But he was also kind of winking an eye to the Spanish audience. In fact, this text was later published again in a second edition in Madrid in 1605, so only a few years after 1596. Miranda's text has a different story because it wasn't published. It's found in an envelope amongst other documents lost in the Archivo de Indias, in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. And it was part of a series of pamphlets written to take sides in political confrontations that took part at the time. He was a defender of Cabeza de Vaca, who was took care of the region very briefly because the people who received him there deposed him very soon and put him in prison and sent him back to Spain. So each one of these texts, it would be very difficult for me. I mean, for a pedagogical reason, I tried to put them together to give a vision, but obviously to make justice to all of them would mean that I will have to explain much more than this. But I hope this helps. Yeah?
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I was thinking, I found very interesting and a very good opportunity the fact that the Consul General of Peru presented the Inca and you presented these three writers, and you mentioned that pre-existing indigenous cultures in the Americas was, if not obliterated, at least misrepresented.
In these poems.
In these poems.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the Inca, being himself or having himself indigenous blood, had like a much more respectful approach towards the pre-existing culture. Is there, how much time we will have to wait until these writers or intellectuals, Spanish or start looking at the pre-existing cultures, in your opinion?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I mean, I didn't want to be unfair to Spain, actually, you know, because this is only a few poems, and obviously they have a clear target audience in mind, as I just said. But the interest for indigenous cultures was very early on, initially spurred by the desire of, obviously, of knowing their languages and cultures in order to understand them and colonize them and convert them. So it's many of the religious orders that moved there, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, etc., really studied very deeply indigenous language. The fact that we know so much about indigenous languages and cultures nowadays, as opposed to other countries that were, or territories that were colonized at the time, is because the Spaniards placed a lot of emphasis on that. So we have people like Bernardino de Sahagún, for example, which despite everything he says, no, this is horrible, the Aztecs are really barbaric, but he's fascinated by them, you know, and at the end of the book, one doesn't really know where he stands, you know, after he's read so much about the sophistication of this culture, and also Bernardo de Sahagún was working with indigenous people at the time, so he was helped by them. We have El Padre Acosta, a Jesuit, who published one of the texts that is considered to be the first modern anthropological treatises ever written, the book about the history of the moral and natural history of the Indies in 1590. So very early on, we have very serious research done, which becomes more and more sophisticated. Even after the Indians had been assimilated and started speaking Spanish, that didn't disappear at all. So there was a lot of interest on maintaining this culture. Of course, then you have other texts that are suggesting the opposite. Diego de Landa, who was in Yucatan, said, oh, we found all these texts written and painted by the indigenous and we burned them all, which every time you read that, your heart sinks a bit. But
mostly coming from maybe from the church that wanted to dominate them, so they wanted to study and understand.
Initially, but there were also the defenders. You know, the church had a double discourse. I mean, don't forget people like Las Casas, who he maybe wasn't very versed in indigenous languages like people like Bernardo de Sahagún, but he was definitely very interested, and still nowadays we consider him to be some of the patron defenders of the Indians, and he fought and he discussed and he published stuff in order to, and actually, if one follows the ideological evolution of Las Casas, who's probably one of the most famous authors of this period, internationally as well, at the beginning he says, well, we have to evangelize them without using violence, and that should be the way forward. But if one looks at the last text that he wrote, this very long Historia General de las Indias, which he never wanted to publish because he himself was convinced that it was too polemical. So he asked the members of his order, please publish this after I'm dead, many years after I'm dead. At the end, he actually says, the colonization is a failure. We should give back the land. We're not doing them any favors. Now we have colonized them, we should leave. He was not the only one. Vitoria in Salamanca, a scholar who had very problems with the Inquisition, said, from a legal point of view, what we're doing in America is completely unjustified. It's not a coincidence that human rights are born in this period because of all the debate that arose from the conquest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very, well, I learned a lot today also.
Thank you so much.
However, I would like to point it out about the Indies is not just one homogeneous place. So I think it would be very important to highlight the context in the place, because these two of them, they wrote from Mexican and the Peruvian, and they found out that the civilization, they were a civilization. They have ancient knowledge and very well developed, as I say, societies and very organized. However, the person who wrote from Argentina,
Miranda,
Miranda, as far as I know, was a more isolated place. So they were writing from the local context they were living. When you arrive to Mexico or in Peru, you will be overwhelming about a lot of things they already done. However, as far as I know, in Argentina, in that place, there was no civilization, only very indigenous and other minorities. So maybe that will be very important to point it out why this difference between the writings about local context.
Yes, it's a very good question. Obviously, one could discuss for days what civilization means, right? And where do you put what does it mean to be more or less civilized? Yeah. Just look at the contemporary politics, and I don't mean to offend the consuls here, but I mean, you know, not only Latin America, but overall, you know, North America is not making us any favors either, nor Europe. Yes, obviously. I mean, that's one of the points that I was trying to make. This duality between barbarism and civilization tends to eliminate differences because it's easier to do it like that, right? That doesn't mean that obviously the Aztec or Mexica, more correctly, civilization in Mexico was extremely sophisticated, as it was the Inca. But actually, Pedro Leonia and Ercilla before him is not dealing with the Incas. He's dealing with the Araucanians, which was a nomadic civilization which didn't establish itself in settlements like the Incas and the Mexica did. So there was obviously very enormous differences. And that's why the priest that I was mentioning earlier, Acosta, is considered to be the first one to write a modern text of comparative anthropology, because he doesn't only study one civilization, he studies several and compares them. That's why it's such an interesting text in many regards. Thank you.
Hi, I guess first of all, thank you very much for introducing us to sort of early modern Spanish-American poetry. I don't know about in Cambridge, but in my university when I did Spanish, all of the sort of Spanish-American literature was quite modern. So you have like Borges, Neruda, all the sort of famous, you know, perennials. But yeah, I think it's obviously mainly dominated by peninsular literature, which is such a shame because, you know, there's so much rich variety about as you say, barbarism and civilization, which is still carried on in, for example, like Neruda, who celebrates so much of his indigenous culture.
Absolutely.
And it's so interesting to sort of trace back the roots and understand the beginnings, because sort of starting it from 18th or 19th century is sort of detached from the early modern and even the medieval cultures. Yeah, so I was just wondering about the sort of Creole, the importance of like Creole in the poetry, because I thought it was a bit ironic that these poets, you know, talking about their indigenous cultures and barbarism, obviously very linked to sort of indigenous people and local culture, but obviously publishing their poetry in their colonial language in Spanish would mean that most of the poetry would only be read and accessible to the elite rather than the local people who they really want to sort of establish a voice for. So how much was the poetry translated into Creole, or how accessible was it for the local people and rather than just academics and the elite?
That's a very good question. Just to correct, well, not correct, explain one thing. When we talk about Creole in this context, we mean people who come from Hispanic descent but are born in Spanish America. That's what it means, Creole, in the Latin American context. So these people not necessarily had to have any contacts with indigenous people just because they were Creoles. And actually, it was precisely this group that grew more and more independent that kind of pushed out the Spaniards in the end. But that question about what was the interaction between the Spanish language and the indigenous languages, as I mentioned earlier, there was all these dictionaries and vocabularies and etc. And some universities taught indigenous languages. In Lima, it was taught, for example, Quechua, because it was necessary to learn it, and especially if you were going to be ordained and then go out converting and evangelizing. There was a lot of oral poetry still transmitted in indigenous languages. El Inca Garcilaso, for example, has a very beautiful chapter dedicated to poetry, where he says, I can't remember exactly the word in Quechua, but he says, in Quechua, poet means creator, inventor, someone who makes out of nothing. And he quotes several songs that he heard when he was little. He said, my mom used to sing this one, and etc. So that tradition doesn't disappear. Bernardino de Sahagún, in his chronicle, with his very big account about Mexico, he also, thanks to the help of several natives, he manages to collect many songs, los cantares mexicanos they're known as today. So all of that is very much alive and influences Octavio Paz, for example, who was, as you know, a great Mexican poet. And so it's just that what made it to the printing press in fiction was extremely little. As I said, the printing press was there mainly to produce religious, political pamphlets, etc., and educate. So the fact that these people were publishing at all is already quite extraordinary. You know, even in Spain, poetry wasn't widely published. But that interaction existed on other levels, on an oral level. It's very interesting to look at vocabularies published at the time. There was one that I particularly like. I can't remember the author now. It was published later in the 16th, early in the 17th century. And it basically, what it gives you, instead of word by word, it gives you sentences to use with locals. ¿A dónde va con ese burro? And then in Quechua underneath, you know. So it's kind of for the everyday life. So you could see that very early on, a sort of a koine, a common language existed. And people, even who didn't know fully Quechua or Mexica, etc., or Nahua, they could interact with some words, as it happens to everybody who moves to another country. You know, sooner or later, some of the things you're going to have to learn. So that oral life still, that exchange still existed. But the publication of texts written in Nahua and Quechua outside the religious context was almost non-existent. Did I answer your question? Thank you. Yeah, 1 minute left. So I don't know if one has a very quick question. There's these notes raised. No? Okay. Well, obviously a lot, because since they were published in the New World, they were really keen on being known in Spain, obviously. They wanted to be known in the capital because that was the way of advancing politically. You know, so if you are known in the capital, that will support your career. And Balbuena sent constant reminders that he wanted to be promoted and carry on. Quevedo, that you mentioned, for example, wrote one of the dedication sonnets to one of the works that Balbuena published in Madrid. He published a pastoral poem, pastoral novel in Madrid, Balbuena, and Quevedo wrote one of the sonnets. So there was that contact. The first one, and with this I close before they kick me out, the first one who talks about the new poets in the New World is Cervantes. Since it's the anniversary, we can also mention him. So we've done the whole lot. Cervantes in La Galatea, which is a pastoral novel that he published in 1589, has a whole section, which is a poem where he talks about Spanish poets that are alive, he says. I'm going to talk only about the ones that are alive. And at the end says, and now I'm going to talk about the great geniuses of the New World. And he gives us the first known list of poets writing in America. Some of them we know nothing about. So that exchange was quite alive. That ocean did not only separate, but also establish bridges. Well, I think with this I really have to finish. Thank you very much.